A prisoner screams as his arm is plunged into a vat of ice water. The temperature is -40 degrees Celsius. Japanese researchers watch with clipboards, timing how long it takes for human flesh to freeze solid. This isn't fiction. This happened thousands of times in a secret laboratory hidden in the mountains of Manchuria during World War II. What you're about to learn will shake you to your core. The Japanese military created a facility so horrific that even today, most people refuse to believe it existed. They called their victims logs, not humans, just pieces of wood to be experimented on. And the Frostbite experiments were just the beginning. Welcome to Unit 731, where science became torture and doctors became monsters. In 1936, deep in the frozen landscape of Manchuria, the Japanese military built something unprecedented. They called it the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Sounds innocent, right? Wrong. This was actually the cover name for the most brutal human experimentation facility in recorded history. General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but twisted microbiologist, convinced his superiors that biological warfare would give Japan a decisive advantage in the coming war. But to develop these weapons, they needed test subjects, lots of them. The facility sprawled across 6 square kilometers. 150 buildings housed laboratories, prison cells, crematoria, and execution chambers. 3,000 staff members worked there, from doctors and researchers to guards and maintenance crews. At any given time, up to 600 prisoners were held captive, waiting for their turn to become experimental subjects. The Japanese had a problem, though. How do you psychologically prepare staff to torture thousands of innocent people? Simple. You dehumanize the victims completely. Prisoners weren't called prisoners. They weren't called people. They were called maruta, logs, just pieces of wood to be used and discarded. This wasn't random cruelty. This was systematic, organized evil with a clear scientific purpose. The Japanese military needed data on how the human body responds to extreme conditions. They were planning to fight in Siberia against the Soviets, where temperatures dropped to -50 degrees Celsius. Soldiers would face frostbite, hypothermia, and death from exposure. The military wanted to know exactly how long a soldier could survive in these conditions, and more importantly, how to treat severe frostbite when it occurred. Enter Yoshimura Hisato, a physiologist who would become one of history's most notorious war criminals. Hisato designed experiments that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and cruelty. His method was sickeningly simple, yet devastatingly effective. Prisoners were dragged from their cells and taken to a special laboratory. Their arms or legs were stripped bare and then submerged in tanks filled with water at various freezing temperatures. Some tanks held water at -10 degrees, others at -20. The most extreme reached -40 degrees Celsius. Researchers stood nearby with stopwatches and clipboards, timing exactly how long it took for human flesh to freeze solid. They documented everything: the color changes in the skin, the victim's screams and pleas, the exact moment when the limb became completely rigid and white. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. The freezing was just the first part of the experiment. Once a limb was completely frozen, researchers would remove it from the ice water and begin testing different methods of rewarming. Some victims had their frozen arms thrust directly into boiling water. Others were placed next to intense fires. Some were gradually warmed using heated blankets. The goal wasn't to help the prisoners. It was to study tissue damage and see which rewarming methods caused the most or least damage to frozen flesh. Researchers wanted to know if rapid rewarming was better than gradual warming. They needed to understand how frostbitten tissue dies and whether any treatment could save severely damaged limbs. Many prisoners endured this torture multiple times. Once their arm was tested, researchers would wait for it to heal somewhat, then freeze a leg or the other arm. Some victims had all 4 limbs subjected to freezing experiments before they finally died from infection, shock, or complications. The sounds from these laboratories were reportedly so horrific that even hardened military personnel requested transfers to other duties. Prisoners would scream for hours as their flesh slowly froze, then scream again as researchers tested rewarming methods on their damaged limbs. But if you think frostbite experiments were the worst thing happening at Unit 731, you're tragically mistaken. The facility operated like a factory of death, with different departments specializing in various forms of human experimentation. The Biological Warfare Division infected prisoners with deadly diseases like plague, anthrax, typhoid, cholera, and tuberculosis. But they didn't just let the diseases run their course. Researchers performed vivisections on living victims to document exactly how each disease progressed through human organs. Vivisection means cutting open living subjects without anesthesia to examine their internal organs while they're still alive. Prisoners were strapped to tables, fully conscious, while doctors cut them open and removed organs one by one to study disease progression. The victims remained alive and aware throughout most of the procedure. Other departments focused on pressure experiments, placing prisoners in vacuum chambers to see how long humans could survive in conditions similar to high-altitude or underwater pressure. Some prisoners were subjected to extreme dehydration studies, being given no water for weeks while researchers documented the effects on human organs. The irradiation department exposed victims to massive doses of X-rays and radioactive materials to study radiation poisoning. Prisoners were burned, frozen, electrocuted, and subjected to chemical weapons testing. Women were deliberately infected with sexually transmitted diseases to study their effects during pregnancy. Children weren't spared either. Young victims were subjected to the same experiments as adults because researchers wanted to understand how age affected human resistance to various conditions. Now here's something that will make your blood boil. The victims of Unit 731 weren't enemy soldiers captured in battle. Most were innocent civilians who had been kidnapped, arrested on false charges, or lured to the facility under false pretenses. Chinese farmers, Korean laborers, Russian prisoners, Mongolian civilians, and even some Allied prisoners of war found themselves trapped in this nightmare. Many had been told they were being taken to work camps or medical facilities for treatment. Instead, they became unwilling subjects in the most brutal scientific experiments ever conducted. The Japanese developed an efficient system for acquiring test subjects. Local police would arrest people on trumped-up charges like thought crimes or anti-Japanese activities. Others were simply kidnapped from their homes or workplaces. Some victims were grabbed off the street while walking to market or visiting family. Once inside Unit 731, escape was impossible. The facility was surrounded by electric fences, guard towers, and patrolling soldiers. Even if someone managed to escape the building, they would still be hundreds of kilometers from safety in the middle of hostile territory. For decades after the war, most people refused to believe these experiments had actually happened. The scale and systematic nature of the cruelty seemed too extreme to be real. But survivor testimonies and confessions from former staff members have confirmed the horrific truth. Hideo Shimizu was just a teenager when he worked at Unit 731 as a maintenance worker. For over 70 years, he kept silent about what he witnessed. But in 2024, at age 94, he finally spoke publicly about his experiences. Shimizu described burying victims' burned remains and witnessing vivisection tables covered with human organs. He said the memories haunted him every day for decades. Dr. Ken Yuasa, a Japanese army doctor who participated in vivisections, gave several interviews before his death. He described cutting open living prisoners and removing their organs while they were still conscious and aware. When asked about nightmares, Yuasa said something chilling. "Sometimes I look at my hands and I remember what I've done with these hands. I don't have any nightmares of what I've done." This casual attitude toward unimaginable cruelty shows how thoroughly the staff had been conditioned to see their victims as less than human. The numbers are staggering and heartbreaking. Conservative estimates suggest that around 3,000 prisoners died directly from experimentation at the main Harbin facility. But Unit 731 operated several other locations throughout Manchuria and China. When you include all facilities and the biological weapons deployed against civilian populations, some historians estimate that up to 200,000 Chinese civilians died as a result of Unit 731's activities. The biological weapons developed at Unit 731 weren't just theoretical, they were actually used in warfare. Japanese planes dropped plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, causing massive outbreaks that killed thousands of civilians. Bacterial bombs containing anthrax and other diseases were deployed against Chinese and Soviet forces. Wells and reservoirs were contaminated with cholera and typhoid, poisoning entire communities. Food supplies were deliberately infected with deadly bacteria before being distributed to civilian populations. These biological attacks violated every international law governing warfare, but they provided Unit 731 with valuable data on how their weapons performed in real-world conditions. Here's the part that will make you question everything you thought you knew about post-war justice. When Japan surrendered in 1945, you might expect that the monsters responsible for Unit 731 faced severe punishment for their crimes against humanity. Instead, something far more disturbing happened. American military intelligence made a deal with the devil. General MacArthur's intelligence officers realized that Unit 731 had collected unprecedented data on biological warfare, human experimentation, and medical research. This information could be valuable for American military and medical programs, so instead of prosecuting the war criminals, the United States granted them immunity from prosecution in exchange for their research data. General Ishii, the mastermind behind Unit 731, was never tried for war crimes. Neither was Yoshimura Hisato, the physiologist who designed the Frostbite experiments. Instead of facing justice, these men were secretly brought to the United States, where they worked with American researchers, sharing their knowledge and helping develop new biological weapons programs. The deal was kept classified for decades. While Nazi war criminals faced trials at Nuremberg, the Japanese war criminals responsible for equally horrific atrocities were given new identities and comfortable lives in exchange for their cooperation with American intelligence. This decision haunts international justice to this day. Thousands of victims died in agony, their suffering used to advance scientific knowledge that was then traded for political advantage. The message was clear: commit atrocities in the name of science and you might be rewarded rather than punished. But here's what really should terrify you about Unit 731. This wasn't the work of a few sadistic individuals acting on their own. This was an organized, systematic program involving thousands of people at every level of Japanese society. Doctors, researchers, military officers, government officials, and support staff all participated in or enabled these atrocities. Many participants were educated, intelligent people who had taken oaths to protect human life and advance medical knowledge. Yet they willingly participated in torture and murder on an industrial scale. This raises disturbing questions about human nature and the conditions that allow ordinary people to become perpetrators of extraordinary evil. The psychological mechanisms that enabled Unit 731, dehumanization, bureaucratic diffusion of responsibility, scientific rationalization, and gradual normalization of atrocities still exist today. Understanding how these factors combine to create such systematic cruelty isn't just historical curiosity. It's essential knowledge for preventing similar atrocities in the future. Recent interviews with surviving staff members reveal how quickly normal people adapted to working in this environment of constant torture and death. New employees were gradually introduced to more extreme experiments, starting with relatively minor procedures and slowly being conditioned to accept increasingly brutal activities as normal scientific work. The facility maintained a veneer of legitimate scientific research, complete with proper documentation, peer review processes, and publication of research results in medical journals. This bureaucratic normality helped staff rationalize their participation in activities they would have found unthinkable in civilian life. What makes the Frostbite experiments particularly disturbing is their calculated nature. These weren't crimes of passion or spontaneous acts of cruelty. Every aspect was carefully planned, documented, and analyzed. Researchers maintained detailed records of each experiment, noting variables like temperature, duration of exposure, victim's age and health status, and response to different treatments. The data collected from these experiments was considered so valuable that it influenced Japanese military strategy and medical treatment protocols for decades. Some of the information about frostbite treatment was later incorporated into medical textbooks and training materials, meaning that knowledge gained through torture continued to benefit people long after the war ended. This creates an ethical dilemma that medical professionals still debate today. Should data obtained through unethical human experimentation ever be used, even if it could save lives? Most medical organizations now prohibit the use of such data, but the question remains complex when dealing with unique information that could prevent suffering. The legacy of Unit 731 extends far beyond the immediate victims. Families lost multiple generations to these experiments. Communities were destroyed by biological weapons testing. The psychological trauma affected survivors, perpetrators, and their descendants for decades. Perhaps most troubling is how thoroughly this history was suppressed for so many years. While the Holocaust was extensively documented and remembered, the atrocities of Unit 731 remained largely hidden from public awareness until the 1980s. This silence allowed many perpetrators to live comfortable lives without facing consequences for their actions. The Japanese government didn't officially acknowledge Unit 731's existence until the 1990s, and even today, many details remain classified or disputed. Some Japanese politicians and historians continue to deny or minimize the scope of these atrocities, causing ongoing pain for survivors and their families. But there's something else about Unit 731 that most people don't know, something that connects directly to modern biological research and raises questions about current scientific practices. The techniques developed for dehumanizing test subjects, the bureaucratic systems for managing systematic cruelty, and the methods for rationalizing unethical research didn't disappear when the facility closed. Some of these approaches were adopted by other research programs around the world, including projects that continued well into the late 20th century. The line between legitimate scientific research and human experimentation has been crossed many times since 1945, often using similar justifications and methods pioneered at Unit 731. And that's not even the most disturbing part. Recent investigations have uncovered evidence suggesting that some biological weapons research based on Unit 731's work continued for decades after the war, hidden within legitimate medical and military research programs. The knowledge gained from thousands of tortured victims became the foundation for